Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on House Resolution 957.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today in support of House Resolution 957, denouncing the Biden administration's open border policies, condemning the national security and public safety crisis along the southwestern border, and urging President Biden to end his administration's open border policies. Mr. Speaker, we have a problem at our southern border. I represent the 1st District of Texas, which is a rural district located in northeast Texas comprised of 17 counties. It borders Louisiana and Arkansas, and although not physically adjacent to the southern border, my district is directly impacted by the open border policies of the Biden administration, as is every corner of America today. The text of my proposed House resolution is simple, straightforward, and to the point. It denounces the Biden administration's open border policies. It condemns the national security and public safety crisis caused by these policies, and it urges President Biden to end them immediately. Why do we need to actually have this resolution on the House today? Well, I'll tell you. It's for 2 primary reasons. One, because we need to admit that there's a problem. This House needs to admit that there's a problem on the border. And number 2, we need to identify the source of the problem itself. Why do we have open borders? It's because of the policies of this administration. Those two things today, to admit and to identify, will help us lead to a solution from this House body and across the 3 branches of government. The border numbers do not lie. In fact, they tell a clear story about the depth of the crisis and the proximate cause rooted in the Biden administration policies. Consider that the total number of illegal aliens encountered along the southern border since President Biden took office exceeds 7 million. At the same time, the Biden administration has released at least 3.3 million of those illegal aliens into the interior of the United States. This number is larger than the entire population of states like Nevada, Arkansas, and Kansas, and in fact, it exceeds the combined populations of Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, and North Dakota together. Additionally, more than 1.7 million gotaways and an untold number of unknown illegal gotaways have successfully evaded capture by the U.S. Border Patrol along the southwestern border. 312 illegal aliens on the terrorist screening data set were encountered along the southwestern border since President Biden took office. By contrast, consider this, that during the 4 years of the prior administration, only 11 illegal aliens on that same list were encountered by Border Patrol. And if we just look in the last quarter, we see how deprived the situation is on the southwestern border. More than 785,000 migrant encounters have been reported just since the beginning of this fiscal year. And last month, record high, the first time ever in American history, 300,000 plus encounters along the southwestern border. In fiscal year 23, 27,000 pounds of fentanyl were seized at the southern border. This is almost double what fiscal year 2022 brought at 14,700 pounds, and it's 6 times higher than in fiscal year 20. We've seen more than 150,000 unaccompanied minors cross over the U.S.-Mexico border, and reports indicate that we have lost contact with over 85,000 of those unaccompanied children. It used to be that most of the migrants that were coming up to our southern border were from Mexico. But now the landscape has changed. In fiscal year 22, migrants from Mexico crossing illegally just made up 33%. Now individuals are coming from across the world, more than 150 countries, and many of those countries have direct ties from terrorism. When I was down at Eagle Pass on the border several months ago, we were told that there was at least 27 countries with ties to terrorism that had immigrants come across that southern border that were encountered in the last couple of years. How astounding and how problematic for this country. Despite the authority that the president has to fix these issues, he simply will not do it. What policies are we talking about? Well, the current administration has ended the migrant protection protocols and the Remain in Mexico policy, which, by the way, we're told by border security people will end if we will just reinstate Remain in Mexico, could end up to 70% of the encounters that we see coming across the border. The administration also has reinstated catch and release policies. They've suspended asylum cooperative agreements with other nations such as El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. They've ignored existing restraints on the abuse of parole. They've halted necessary border wall construction. They've undermined the Immigration and Customs Enforcement's core mission by preventing them from deporting certain aliens who violate the United States law. They've enabled use of smartphone apps to facilitate the release of border crossers into the United States. And they've redirected Customs and Border Patrol agents to do ICE paperwork processing instead of focusing on law enforcement work. In short, the current administration's policies have led to the numbers that we're seeing today. Numbers like 2.5 million just in the last fiscal year, and 2.3 million in the year before, and 1.74 million in the year before, compared to numbers like 400,000 or 500,000 a year under the prior administration. One is too many, but 2.5 million is egregious. It's led to situations like overcrowded classrooms, children trafficked to do work in industries unsuited for children, unsuited for anybody. Millions in unpaid medical bills in hospitals across the U.S. overwhelm first responders in border communities. Homeless veterans who are getting kicked out of shelters in favor of illegal aliens, and even the deaths of millions of Americans. Tens of thousands of Americans by fentanyl because of the increased fentanyl crisis. These effects are being felt in rural and metropolitan communities in both blue and red states. As of the beginning of December, the city of Denver had spent over $33 million to house, feed, and educate around 30,000 illegal aliens. Chicago residents are up in arms as well, as are New York City residents. Their mayor says that this crisis will, quote, destroy the city. In 2022, here's the number I was citing for you just a second ago. 73,654 people died from fentanyl overdose in the U.S. This is more than double the amount of deaths in 2019 and the highest in American history. Assaults on Border Patrol agents doubled just last year. Nevertheless, the Biden administration is doubling down on these open border policies. What will it take for them to wake up? What will it take for us to get back to a solution, to find a solution for the border crisis? There's lots to be done, lots that can be done by this body and the Senate and across this government. But it starts with leadership in the White House, policy leadership in the White House, to undo the current open border policies and to return to the policies that were preventing this crisis before. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 957 denounces these open border policies, condemns the national security and public crisis that we're seeing today because of that, and urges the President to end those policies immediately. The people of America deserve better. They deserve to have the sovereignty and the geographic borders of this nation protected. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this country is facing real problems. The right to bodily autonomy is under attack across the nation. There was a school shooting just 4 days into the new year, leading to the tragic death of an 11-year-old and the injury of 7 others. Our immigration system cannot function because Congress has failed to reform it for over 30 years, and Republican hardliners are threatening to shut down the government if we don't, quote, shut down the border. House Republicans are not working to respond to any of these problems as they are too busy fighting among themselves. Their historic dysfunction has even prompted multiple members of their conference to complain that they have nothing to campaign on. Today's resolution is not going to help. This resolution will do nothing to solve the situation at the border. It proposes no solutions of any kind. In fact, this resolution is nothing more than a highlight reel of the Republican talking points in immigration that we have heard over and over from Republicans since President Biden was sworn into office. So let me say once again, the border is not open. The Biden administration has been removing people at a record clip over the last few months. restricting asylum with a new regulation, and placing thousands of families in expedited removal. Since the end of Title 42 last May, the Biden administration has removed or returned nearly 500,000 individuals. That is more than the number of people removed in all of fiscal year 2019 under the Trump administration. But because President Biden isn't saying that he wants to shoot migrants trying to cross the border, like Governors Abbott and DeSantis have, Republicans don't think he's doing enough. And despite my colleagues' claims, fentanyl is largely not coming into this country between ports of entry. More than 90% of fentanyl interdicted is stopped at ports of entry, where cartels attempted to smuggle it through, primarily in vehicles driven by American citizens. So I'm not sure how anyone can say the border is open. On top of this, at every turn, Republicans have voted against giving the administration the resources it needs to do its job. Nearly every current House Republican voted against the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the fiscal year 2023 omnibus. Both of these bills provided significant additional funding to increase staffing and modernize ports of entry to combat the smuggling of people and drugs. We need to work together to address our broken immigration system. Right now, we have a system where many people come into this country, present themselves to Border Patrol people, or do not. They are apprehended. They claim asylum. Under our law, they're entitled to a hearing before an immigration judge. But because we don't have enough asylum officers and immigration judges, their case isn't heard for years. So they're told to come back in 4 years or whatever for their hearing. And the Republicans call this catch and release. Well, if the Biden administration's proposals for funding for more border guards, more CBP people, and more asylum judges and more immigration judges would be approved, then these claims could be adjudicated in a matter of weeks, not years. And those entitled to asylum would be granted it in weeks and would be permitted to work, and those not entitled to it would be swiftly deported. But because of the lack of resources caused by Republican insistence on voting against those resources, this doesn't happen, and we have the catch and release system and millions of people staying in this country when they shouldn't, entirely because of the Republicans. And then they say it's President Biden's open border policy. We need to work together to address our broken immigration system. Unfortunately, House Republicans insist they will only consider H.R. 2, their fantasy draconian enforcement-only bill, which stands no chance of passage in the Senate. Real solutions require compromise, but MAGA Republicans aren't interested in compromise. What they are interested in is passing bills like the one before us today. Or I should say resolutions. This is not a bill. This resolution is nothing but empty rhetoric designed to score cheap political points that bring us no closer to meaningful reform. I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and I hope we can get to serious work. But meanwhile, we should oppose this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I sure get a kick out of listening to the gentleman from New York who doesn't know a darn thing about the border crisis and gets to stand up and say, oh, by golly, you know, all the fentanyl, 90% of that fentanyl, boy, howdy, they're catching that right there in the port of entry. Well, you know why they catch it at the port of entry? Because that's where you have x-rays for the vehicles coming in. You have dogs that sniff. Most of the vehicles are getting picked up and looked at. Same with the pedestrians coming across. But you know why you don't find it between the ports of entry, where 1.9 million people have come into the Biden administration, Mr. Speaker? You know why they don't find it? Because right now, you can literally drive. Let's say if you're on the Tohono O'odham Reservation, you can drive. They have 62 miles right there along the border. You can drive that. And you're going to see maybe 1 or 2 agents in that entire area. You know why? Because the rest of them are processing all of the people that the agents have had to encounter. So they're out at these facilities. So when I was down in Lukeville right before Christmas, I'm standing there I go talking and I say, hey, where are you from? Guinea. How about you? Burkina Faso. How about you? Senegal. How about you, India? How about you, Pakistan? They're coming from all over the world to Lukeville, Arizona. I happened to be there when in that 2-week period, 30,000 encounters took place in that area alone. Oh yeah, this border is secure, it's closed. But what they don't tell you is that you've got a bunch of people coming in between the ports of entry that we can't even go. You know what? Because when I was down in Lukeville, we can't catch them. Why can't we catch them? We sense them. Some places we have sensors. Why couldn't we catch them? Because as I drove along for miles along that border, I didn't see a single agent. Why? Because they're all back at the facility processing. That's what they're doing. That's what these guys have done. That's what the Democrats have done. So, when they say paroles is a good thing, the statute's real clear. It's supposed to be particularized. It's supposed to be case by case. We actually heard in oversight today that the 1 million+ people who've received parole, hey, yeah, they're all being adjudicated on a case-by-case basis. I asked the witness, have you ever been down there and watched the process before they grant somebody parole? I saw it on video. Go with me sometime. Stand down there, visit, watch it, and you will be stunned to know that there's virtually no vetting whatsoever. Because why? We're relying on those individuals to tell us where they're from and who they are. That's how open this border is. So I just want to say that this gentleman, the gentleman from New York, also explained the reason that they support this illegal migration is because they want people to pick our vegetables. That's how they view people coming in from all around the world. I support this resolution and urge my colleagues to do as well. Yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the reason the gentleman from Arizona couldn't find any Border Patrol agents is because Republicans have refused to vote the appropriations to greatly increase the number of Border Patrol agents that the Biden administration has proposed. We know there aren't enough Border Patrol agents. The administration knows this. The administration has proposed funding for many more Border Patrol agents, but the Republicans have refused to vote it. And then they complain that they can't find Border Patrol agents along the border. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
The lady from Washington is recognized.
The ranking Democrat on the Immigration Subcommittee.
The lady from Washington is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to House Resolution 957. Today, the Republican majority has brought up a pointless resolution that does nothing to address the situation at the border and repeats the same tired and untrue talking points about the border. I, too, want to be clear. The border is not open. No matter how many times my Republicans repeat it, it doesn't make it true. But every time Republicans go on television with these false claims, the only people that are being empowered by those false claims are the cartels, who use those false claims to then entice families to come to the border believing that it's open. The fact is that Republicans have not had any interest in doing anything to fix the border because they want to keep chaos at the border until the election. They want to use immigrants as a political tool to ramp up fear and xenophobia in the run-up to the election. And don't just take it from me, Mr. Speaker. Take it from my Republican colleagues themselves. On the issue of immigration, Representative Nell said, quote, "I'm not willing to do too damn much right now to help a Democrat and to help Joe Biden's approval rating." And Representative Crenshaw said about Republicans holding Ukraine aid hostage for unworkable border policies, quote, "Some might even be afraid of giving up the border as a campaign issue. They don't want a solution," end quote. That's from Republicans, not from Democrats. And that is the truth. There are real changes that are needed to immigration policies that haven't been updated in 30 years. Some even have bipartisan support. But none of them have moved because Republicans don't really want a solution to this. That is why time and time again, when Republicans had a chance to support more resources and personnel for the border, they voted no. In 2021 and 2023, nearly every current House Republican voted against providing additional funding to increase staffing and resources at ports of entry to combat smuggling of people and drugs. And when my colleague from Arizona says that everyone's coming to the border, he's not wrong in that we've taken away all of the legal pathways for people to actually be able to come here. And the only one that seems to be remaining open is now the border. And when he says that agents aren't out there, it's because they're processing, well, then you should want to fund agents to be able to process so that we can have border agents that are out in the field doing the work that they need. The President's supplemental funding request for the border actually does include more money for immigration judges and asylum officers that would help process people in a legal and orderly fashion. It has money for cities to be able to help people work and support themselves as they wait for their immigration papers to be processed. And we could pass the Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Worker Modernization Act, which are both bipartisan, to help bring real solutions to a broken immigration system. But Republicans won't agree to that. Why? Because it actually would help make the situation at the border better.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady an additional minute.
The lady from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Republicans won't agree to that. Why? Because it would help make the situation at the border better, and they don't want that under any circumstance. They'd rather continue the cruelty of seeing migrants fleeing horrific circumstances thanks to Republican governors who use their own military to block Border Patrol agents from doing their jobs and saving lives. The cruelty of blaming immigrants for everything just to try and win elections. The cruelty of separating mothers from their babies. That is the extreme Republican playbook. Let's stop wasting everyone's time with this empty rhetoric and work on some real solutions. Vote no on this fact-free resolution. I yield back.
Lady from Washington yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, a nation without borders is not a nation at all. Currently, we have an administration that prioritizes illegal immigrants over American citizens, over our own constituents. Since President Biden took office, more than 8 million illegal immigrants have entered our country without consequence. 300,000 since December alone. Within months, there will be more illegal immigrants than the population of my home state of New Jersey, a state that would rank 10th in population made up of illegals. And yet this president, Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and my Democratic colleagues continue to deny that the crisis even exists, allowing millions of illegal immigrants, many from countries that hate America, threatens our national security, and it is wrong. Using taxpayer dollars to give illegals immigrant-free health care and making Americans pay for it is wrong. Sacrificing the education of our American children to turn their schools into shelters for illegal immigrants is wrong. Cutting public safety to fund services like free housing, free legal aid, and welfare for illegal immigrants that many Americans struggle to afford themselves is wrong. College education subsidies for illegal immigrants is wrong. Them slipping through those on the terror watch list slipping through our borders is wrong. Sanctuary state status, sanctuary city status is wrong. Standing idly by while tens of thousands of American young people, die at the hands of illicit fentanyl that is flowing freely across our border is wrong. President Biden and this administration has had the power to stop it, but they refuse. Our Democratic colleagues had a chance to stop it by voting for H.R. 2, but they refused. 4 years ago, this didn't exist. And now our Senate colleagues have refused to take up H.R. 2 and are working to increase incentives for illegal immigrants to come into our country. We need to get serious. Those responsible must be held accountable. And once again, I demand that this administration, for once, put American people first. And I hope and I pray that everyone will vote for this good resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman From California, Mr. Correa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me just say to my colleagues on this floor that what is really wrong is to misstate the problem, the facts to the American public. I've been to the border numerous times in the last year as a member of Homeland Security Subcommittee. Just got back from Latin America. I've spoken to the border guards at our border. You know what they've told me? They need relief. They need resources. They're tired of working overtime, 2 double shifts, not enough personnel, not enough resources, not enough technology. That's the answer to the problem. The problem isn't an open border. The border is not open. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is a worldwide refugee challenge. Italy, Greece, Germany, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, all have a problem.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Solution is simple, Mr. Speaker. Let's fund for additional resources for our borders, for border security. Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans, let me repeat, Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans are joining the President in negotiating a solution. House Democrats are there. I ask my colleagues across the aisle, join us. Let's come up with a solution. America deserves solutions, not political statements. Mr. Speaker, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the situation at the southern border is utterly untenable. It is an urgent national security and public safety crisis. Everyone knows it. The American people know it. Members on both sides of the aisle in this House know it. And the President sure ought to know it. What we have seen is absolutely beyond anything we have ever seen before. In the 3 years of this administration, there have been 6.7 million illegal border crossings, 1.7 million gotaways, folks that just evaded detection by Border Patrol. In the last month, we had days where there were 10,000 illegal crossings in a single day. These numbers are staggering and they are unprecedented, but what is the meaning of those numbers? Well, on the one hand, it has been an absolute bonanza for the cartels, but on the other hand, it has been an absolute tragedy for the American people. As we have truly incredible amounts of fentanyl coming into the country, taking the lives of young people in every community in our country every day, we have more and more people suffering through the horror of human trafficking and being victimized. And we have growing national security risks every day with the increasing likelihood of terrorists coming into this country, putting all Americans at risk. Mr. Speaker, this isn't brain surgery. We know what a secure border looks like. The House has passed legislation, the Secure the Border Act, with common sense reforms, beefing up our border security with physical barriers, with technology, with Border Patrol, with common sense legal reforms to the parole and the asylum process, even reinstating Remain in Mexico. That one simple step would solve a good portion of this problem. This should not be a political issue. It is not a partisan issue. It is a basic matter of governance. It is the most basic thing that Americans ought to be able to expect from our government. It is a most basic responsibility of a civil society and of a nation state. That is why Americans, Democrat, Republican, Independent, it doesn't matter, are urgently calling for change. This resolution gives voice to that call for change, and I'm proud to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
The lady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I proudly represent El Paso, Texas, a border community, and I rise today in strong opposition to this resolution, which is nothing more than a collection of Republican talking points. Let's be clear, reforming our outdated immigration laws is our responsibility, a congressional responsibility. And it's our responsibility to do so in a way that actually works and doesn't sacrifice our values. Some Republicans prefer to go on TV to complain, and others openly acknowledge they don't want a solution, including the Speaker of the House, who says he wants to wait until after the election. To those who claim their unworkable Secure the Border Act is a solution, please read your bill. You'll see that fundamental to it is that Mexico will accept every single migrant the U.S. sends to them. That's never happened. It will never happen. So H.R. 2 is nothing more than a fantasy for you all. But for those Republicans who are tired of complaining, want to do their job, and really want a solution, join our bipartisan...
An additional
30 seconds.
minute.
Thank you.
Ladies recognized for 1 minute. And the chair would remind all members to direct their comments to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Ranking Member, and Mr. Speaker. For those Republicans who are tired of complaining and really want a solution, please join our bipartisan coalition, a coalition that worked on real solutions, legislative solutions. It's called the Dignity Act of 2023. It addresses the border and beyond, does it in a way that doesn't sacrifice our values. Please join us. Let's fix this together, because we can. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Lady yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to denounce President Biden's open border policies that have fueled the invasion, I repeat, invasion of our country through our southern border. I wonder how many of my liberal friends across the aisle have actually even been to the border. Let us be clear, this is a crisis of Biden's making. He has not been to the border, nor has Vice President Harris been to the border. They've been to a parking lot in El Paso, Texas, and that's as good as they could do. So over 3 years now, Biden has ignored calls from the American people to secure our border and protect American lives. This administration's failed policies have allowed over 8 million illegal immigrants to cross into our country, forcing border states such as my home state of Texas to take matters into their own hands, only to be attacked by Biden's out-of-reach DOJ and be sued for protecting the lives of Texans. It's time for President Biden and his administration are held accountable for the lack of action at our southern border. From my very first day, I have fought against the radical left's open border and pro-amnesty policies, and the House Republicans have done their job with real solutions and passed H.R. 2 to fully fund and secure our border, but that too has been ignored by Schumer and President Biden. This is not the border between New York and New Jersey. It is totally different. Some don't see it that way. So today we take another stand. I urge my colleagues to support H.Res. 957 to denounce President Biden's open border policies. In God we trust. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Representative Jackson Lee.
Lady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the distinguished gentleman for yielding, and I am very glad that my colleagues and some from Texas want to have the real truth discussed on this floor. The real truth is that President Biden does not have and has not fostered or encouraged open borders. In fact, the United States does not have open borders. It would be truly an act of real leadership if Republicans would work with Democrats and the present administration to do as was done during the Reagan administration when, yes, whether you agreed or disagreed, immigration laws were passed. And if this Republican contingent of members, House and Senate, would work, we would find the resolution to some of the concerns that we have. It is very clear that the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas is not a solution. The present resolution that we have is not a solution. Today, there are approximately 38,000 people in immigration detention, which is 4,000 more than what DHS is funded for. And people without facts don't realize, somewhat similar to Trump. Many of us are concerned about due process rights. But when accusations are made about one party is better than another, that is not true. And of course, there were those removed under Title 42, and the Biden administration did that when that law was in place. The total is nearly equivalent to the number of people removed in all of fiscal 2019 in the past administration. But this administration wants to put forward reasonable and effective legislation so that we will get an additional 1,300 Border Patrol agents, 375 immigration judges, 1,600 asylum officers to speed up processing of asylum claims, 1,000 CBP officers, new detection technology for ports of entry, additional investigative capabilities to combat fentanyl trafficking. And
Gentlelady, an additional 1 minute.
Lady's recognized for 1 minute.
And quickly, fentanyl is not an immigration issue. It's a criminal issue. It's a crime issue. It's where we have to come together with our law enforcement across America. $1.4 billion more in grants to help communities. But what I will say, the utilization of state laws that effectively are not governed by the Constitution. States do not have immigration authority. And blocking the Border Patrol is not an effective immigration tool. And causing a mother and two of her children to die is not an immigration tool. I don't want to be a part of it. I want to be a part of the work that the President is doing. Thank you, Mr. President, the Vice President, with the Senate, that I want this House to be doing so that we can, in fact, have border solutions that work. None where visas are able to be given to the appropriate people. Limiting or removing parole does not work. 8.3 million relatives of U.S. citizens and legal residents awaiting a green card. That does not work. Restricting immigration parole is a lose-lose situation. Rejecting DACA young people who are, in fact, ready to be paramedics, lawyers, doctors, teachers. White House calls on Congress to advance critical national security. All of this is what President Biden is doing, and I would make the argument that this is what we should be doing in order to have real
time's expired.
Real immigration reform. I yield back and ask that we do not support the underlying
Gentleman
amendment.
from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
If we were to ask the cartels to design a border security apparatus for the United States, it would look very much like the one the Biden administration has given us. Just enough of the illusion of border security for them to be able to charge a hefty premium, but not enough to actually stop their trafficking of humans and drugs into our country. And the truth is, the Biden administration has every single authority that the Trump administration has, and they have more resources than the Trump administration has to secure the border, but they refuse to do so. And they blame Texas, they blame us in Congress for saying they need more money. But as one Border Patrol agent I talked to just 2 weeks ago on the border said, it's like we're holding a bucket in front of an open fire hydrant and they keep asking for more buckets. We need to cap the fire hydrant. The problem is, from Congress's perspective, is we send over a check to the administration, and on the memo column we put border security. But this administration has taken that check and cashed it and used it to aid and abet cartels in the human trafficking and the drug trafficking into our country. We have to stop this. Monies that's set aside for natural disasters to help Americans, like through FEMA, goes to help NGOs. This entire cottage industry where cartels bring migrants to our country, and then our border security apparatus, along with NGOs and federal taxpayer funding, used to transport them throughout the country, where many times the cartels pick up that relationship and keep migrants in indentured servitude and sex slave. We cannot continue to allow this to happen. Right now, what's happening, when we talk about processing, who's coming across the border right now? Primarily, it's military-aged single adults. And then when our border security has to collapse to a processing center, it leaves hundreds of miles open to where we have what we call known gotaways, and then even more dangerous, the unknown gotaways that are coming across our border. We have no idea what's happening. We have to secure our border. It's a humanitarian issue. It's a national security issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Ramirez.
The lady from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, Chair. I rise to oppose House Resolution 957. I have a question. If we have open borders, which is what I hear in Homeland Security all the time, then let me ask this question. Why are people dying, children, in the Rio Grande attempting to enter our country? Let me ask you another question. Why are there over 38,000 people right now sitting in immigration detention? If the borders are open, why are families living in fear of separation by deportation? We know many of them because they go to church with us, or at least I go to church with some of those immigrant families. So if Republicans are not serious about making real policy change, because if they were, they would do a couple of the things that you see on my board here. Allocate resources and capacity to make our borders safer. Adopt smart tech to stem fentanyl brought in the U.S. through the ports of entry, much of it by American citizens. Expedite and expand work permits to address our labor shortages that are driving inflation. Alleviate the conditions across Latin America that motivate families to migrate. I've been to the border. My mother crossed the border with me. And I can tell you that the borders are not, in fact, open. I invite those serious about change, though, to support any or all of the solutions, the things that we were sent to do here, find solutions. And I invite you to abandon House Resolution 957, which is a political stunt, and those sham impeachments that make no meaningful policy progress. I urge my colleagues to see through the political performance of 2023. Let's leave it in 23. We shouldn't have to have brought it into 24. And let's vote hell no to House Resolution 957. I yield back.
Reserve.
The chair would like to remind members to direct their comments to the chair. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Van Dyne.
The lady from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of my Texas colleagues' resolution condemning the purposeful actions of the Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas for turning over our nation's security and southern border to Mexican cartels and ushering in a vast tsunami of over 10 million illegal immigrants who are overwhelming our cities and our states. 10 million illegal immigrants have come here illegally, and yet my Democrat colleagues insist the border's closed. Nothing to see here. Indeed, the Biden administration has enabled a horrific new era of human slavery, forced labor, and child sex trafficking that is destroying the lives of tens of thousands of people and causing crime to escalate across America, all because they refuse to enforce our laws that are already written. This isn't about creating a whole new immigration process. This is about forcing the administration and agencies to do their jobs. Democrats admit the president's additional funding request isn't about securing the border. It's not about national security, but it's about processing illegals faster into the country. With more than 100,000 dead Americans from Chinese-supplied and Mexican cartel trafficked fentanyl into our country, we need to understand that we are at war. The Biden administration has gleefully brought this misery and destruction to the American people. The first job of the federal government is to protect our rights and protect our homeland. Unfortunately, under the Biden administration's disgraceful and dangerous actions, the American people are less safe. We face a national security catastrophe, and the leftists running the White House could not care less. All of Congress should stand up for the American people, stand up for truly secure borders, and empower Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the brave men and women of Border Patrol to do their jobs. Lock down the border and fight the Mexican cartels. This is what Americans want, and this is what Americans deserve. I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady's time expires. The gentleman from Texas reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Tlaib.
Excuse me, how many minutes?
2 minutes.
Gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, there's no denying that our immigration system is broken. It's so deteriorated. The last time that Congress passed any immigration reform, real reform, was in 1996. That was 28 years ago. And it's not just Democrats or Republicans to blame. Frankly, both parties have completely failed to find the courage to really, truly dig deep and fix our broken immigration system. The prisons first, humanity later doesn't work. We have a responsibility to act. I have to tell you, as a former immigration attorney, I remember U.S. citizens waiting 10 years or more just to bring their children over, and it's even longer for those in Mexico. Siblings, 12, 15, even 20 years, waiting to unite with their family members. The system is completely broken and does not work for our country. Our immigrant neighbors deserve to live with human dignity, stability, and equal recognition as valued members of communities. We have so many U.S. citizen spouses now that cannot have their spouses, right now, their immigrant spouses, to be able to adjust their status here in the United States. Look it up. It's so important to understand that we need to protect our immigration process by actually making sure it meets the needs of our country. For far too long, millions of our immigrant neighbors have waited in limbo while they face numerous challenges and obstacles to obtain legal status and pathway to citizenship. And please remember that migrants and asylum seekers come to our country to escape violence and seek a better life for our community, for their families. They should not be vilified, locked in cages, or dehumanized. I really ask all of us to please stop with the fear-mongering. These policies are rooted in racism, xenophobia, and white nationalism, and we must change our course. Thank you.
The lady yields. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman.
The lady from Wyoming is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For years, we have sounded the alarm about the crisis at our southern border, yet this can no longer be called a crisis. What we face is an existential threat to our nation, and it is a threat enabled by the Biden administration. Since taking office, the Biden administration has flouted and defied countless laws of the United States in order to prop up their blatantly illegal open border policies. Countless officials, including Biden, Vice President Harris, and Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas, have violated their oath of office by failing to faithfully discharge the duties of their offices and protect our nation. Under President Biden, 8 million illegal aliens have been stopped at our borders, and over 1.7 million known gotaways have entered the nation, with an untold number of illegal aliens crossing undetected. In total, Biden's border failures have resulted in illegal immigrants totals that are well over 14 times the entire population of the state of Wyoming. The 94 executive actions taken in President Biden's first 100 days alone have decimated all progress made by the Trump administration to secure our nation, ending the Remain in Mexico program, halting construction on the border wall, and handicapping the ability for federal law enforcement to actually enforce the law. These actions and dozens like them by the Biden administration have deliberately created an environment where the rule of law no longer exists, where fentanyl kills our children and friends, and where no community in America can be considered safe. Our hospitals are incurring literally tens of millions of dollars of uncompensated care, and our farmers are going broke because of the destruction of their crops. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of H. Resolution 957 and call on the Biden administration to end their dangerous open border policies that place Americans at risk. Thank you, and I yield back.
Lady yields back. I would remind members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. Gentleman from Texas is reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we know from the newspapers and from talking to our colleagues in the Senate that Senate negotiators, Democrats and Republicans, are close to an agreement on a bill to provide for border security on an immigration bill. But the Speaker of the House has said that no matter what they agree to, he's not willing to look at it, that he's not willing to have this House pass any immigration bill whatsoever. So it ill behooves the Republicans to decry lack of border security when the Speaker of the House has announced that under no circumstances will they do anything about it. I reserve.
From New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes from the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Self.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of my Texas colleague, Resolution 957. We all know the eye-watering figures, the 10 million, greater than the population of our seventh largest state, 1.7 million gotaways, I want to focus on the 100,000 minors that we have literally lost in the interior of the United States, supposedly because under some treaty, we are not authorized to collect and store information on minors. So they are simply in the United States, who knows doing what, slave trade, indentured servanthood. The cartels will collect their pound of flesh from the people that pay them to bring them across the border. They are in every state. They are in many of our cities. They are now collecting from indentured servants, from the sex trade, from the slavery that we have, from the fentanyl that they bring across and sell. No new policy, no new law, no new tax dollars are a solution for this issue. It is the lawless behavior of the administration that must change. If you want a solution, the solution is, I urge my colleagues across the aisle to address the lawless behavior of this administration. That is the only solution to secure our border. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas is reserves.
Before I reserve, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to let the gentleman from New York know that we have no further speakers, and I am prepared to close.
Same with me.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I grant myself all my remaining time.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, we need to work together to address our broken immigration system. Enforcement alone cannot fix it. We know this because that approach has largely failed for 3 decades. We need to update our immigration system so that it meets the needs of our country. We need a balanced, bipartisan approach that expands lawful pathways. This will help relieve pressure on the border and allow people to come to this country in an orderly and efficient way. But this resolution will accomplish none of that. Instead of reaching across the aisle in search of meaningful solutions, this resolution uses empty rhetoric to score cheap political points. This resolution doesn't claim to accomplish anything for immigration reform. All it does is condemn President Biden. In a Congress that has broken records for its lack of accomplishments, this is just one more useless bill that does nothing to help the American people. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are some of the things that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said today. The border is not open. Mr. Correa, Ms. Jackson-Lee, Mr. Nader all said that. Ms. Jayapal said they don't want a solution. Mr. Correa also said we need more resources. And in fact, that was one of the mantras throughout the debate today on the other side of the aisle was more resources, more resources, more resources. But let me just tell you, funding is not the issue. Funding is at an all-time high for our border protection. Despite border protection funding being at an all-time high, we are seeing record high encounters at the border. Why is that? There's one reason for that. It's the administration's current policies. I provided this analogy several times to individuals over the months leading up to this debate, and that is an analogy about a flood at my house. When I was being elected, I had a flood. I came home one night and there was water all over the floor in my house. My first reaction was not to stand there and say, you know what, I need to go get a bunch of moppers to come in here and mop up the water that's there. My first reaction was find where the water leak is and turn off the valve. Shut off the flood. That's exactly what we need to do. That's what this resolution sounds the alarm about. It resounds the alarm about. We've been talking about this for years on this side of the aisle. But apparently, both sides of the aisle are not getting the message. This resolution helps us to admit that there is a problem. It helps us to identify the cause, and it helps us to solve it. Just like the flood in my house, what would happen if the other side of the aisle was in charge of that would say, well, let's just let the flood continue. We're going to just hire a bunch of more moppers to come in and try to clean it up. That is simply not the solution. You got to turn that valve off first. You got to stop the incursion of water, and in this case, you have to stop the incursion of the migrants coming across our border illegally. It's a matter of the rule of law. It's a matter of the sovereignty of the United States. It's a matter of enforcing those laws that are on the books today, and it's frankly a matter of will of the administration to put back in place those policies that were working before 2021 began. Mr. Speaker, I'm astounded by the fact that even today, we're hearing over and over again from the other side of the aisle that the border is not open. I would urge my colleagues to go visit. Having been in Eagle Pass and El Paso, I can tell you it is casual. That's the word I would use for it. Watching people, myself, come across the border casually and then taken right to a processing center, and then before you know it, out into the interior of the United States, who knows where, and who knows when to be found again, and who knows what they're going to do in the midst. We are seeing a lot of rise of terrorism across this world, and to allow our southern borders to have the porous nature they do presently puts our nation at risk. It is a national security issue that must be solved. We must have the will to do it. And frankly, the Republicans have already proposed the right solution. That's H.R. 2. I was proud to be one of the original 8 co-sponsors of H.R. 2, and we need to pass that in its entirety. We certainly need to work with Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans and the administration to get that done. But before that happens, and for the last 3 years, what should have been happening is the administration should have enforced the policies that the prior administration had in place to solve the problem once and for all, to get us to a place where we can, in fact, have our sovereignty restored and our geographic borders protected and the interior of the United States protected. I urge my colleagues to support the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields.